Yes, yes. Okay, okay.
So I welcome you all for this meeting. I request all of you to keep it on mute for the time being, and only when you want to speak, you should keep it on. Otherwise, so far as the group leader is concerned, he can keep it continuously on. Rest of the people can actually put it on only when they want to speak. So I welcome you to this new type of meeting. All the time we have been talking about the lecture meetings, and this is specifically we have said that this is not going to be the lecture meeting. Now this model has been tested, and for at least 2 years, because we have been meeting in Thane for the last 3 years, and out of that last 3 years, 2 years we were meeting physically, and 1 year we have been meeting on this particular platform. So this model has been tested, and it has been successful. People like it, and they get lot of information benefit, and therefore we are trying to implement this. Now you would wonder ki why there are so many lectures and then CP circles. Why do we want this? So the answer to this is that this is slightly different model, because in normal CP circle there is always a one-way traffic. So here we are going to have a discussion. So all those people, whether you are having good knowledge or not having knowledge, are allowed to speak, because in normal meetings people hesitate. Now here we, over a period of time, we will see that everybody, each and every person can actually speak anything. I mean, anything in the sense, the questions that may be in his mind. So even the learned people also become the students. They also ask the question sometimes. Sometimes we forget very, very small things. So they don't hesitate. Please ask the questions unless and until you, because whatever questions people are asking, that is there in the mind of another 10 persons. So it's not only you, but only thing is that you are making an effort to ask the question, and the speaker also sometimes get updated based on
Yes.
whatever questions that you are asking. So first of all, I don't want to take too much of time. I would like to thank you in the beginning itself, because I am seeing a lot of very, very senior people who have been at least 10 to 15 years senior to me. And I'll just quickly tell you the purpose of this kind of discussion. See, here we are talking about appeals. So the people who are actually in appeal practice is a different category, because all of us are otherwise, practicing chartered accountant, but only 10% or 15% of them are only in appeals. So exactly what happens in appeal, or what are the precautions to be taken in appeal, how it works. So all these things will be, today or tomorrow will be discussed, and this will be discussed by the people who have been practicing appeal practice for the last several years. So this meeting will also trying to bridge the gap between the person who wants to give their work to the various people, and naturally the other people who are actually in appeal practice will also be able to get in touch with the people who are actually wanting to give the work. So once over a period of time, all of us will become friend, and anybody will be able to pick up the phone and call a senior person, and over a period of time can actually take the professional help from that person. My role in this is very, very limited. I am just the organizer. I am very, very junior student in this appeal practice, although I have handled appeal, but very on the minuscule level. But there were several cases which I might have given to some other people who are handling the appeal practice, but myself I have handled very little appeals. So having said this, I will request, this was just a brief, and before we go further, I would like to tell you that we'll be meeting every 15 days, same time on Thursday, and continue with these similar kind of topics. With this basic introduction, I would request our senior member, Sri Adil Sathe, to inaugurate this different type of meeting, which is happening at 10 o'clock. As he has rightly said, that it's a very unique kind of a meeting where everybody is sleeping, we are working and learning. So that is how people progress. So I'll request now CA Anil Sathe to inaugurate. He can also narrate in brief some of his experiences, because he'll be there with us even in the subsequent meetings. So he has so many experiences, so many instances which he can narrate every time also. So I would request him to inaugurate this meeting. So over to you, CA Anil Sathe.
Good evening, all of you, and I'm really thankful to Sagar for asking me to inaugurate something of this sort. And as usual, we have, considering the fact that it is 10 o'clock, a phenomenal response. I can see 37 or 38 participants already. When Sagar asked me to inaugurate, yes, I've been in appeal practice for quite some time. I must say that my own appeals I've been arguing for maybe now 35, 37 years. And as a tax counsel who is matters are referred to me, I've been arguing for now 3 decades or so. My first reaction when Sagar asked me was direct tax appeals, do they have a very very rosy picture or they don't? I thought that this whole concept is unique and required for the reason that though appeals over a period of time might reduce to some extent, we will have better quality appeals going forward. And the scenario today is that the appeal mechanism itself has undergone a change, and I'll briefly dwell upon that before I give the proceedings over to Deepak. Uh, Today's topic is also very interesting, and since what is going to happen over the next maybe few years initially and then going forward a decade, I look at it this way, that the first appeal is already faceless, and I don't see that situation changing for some time. So the manner of advocacy is going to change significantly, because at least at the first appeal stage, you are going to be left with no option but to primarily put forth your case in the written form. I remember that the art of advocacy is putting across your matter to people who are going to listen to you. And since Sagar said that I have some instances to narrate, I recall one of them when I was arguing before the tribunal. This must be somewhere in 97 or 98, where I argued the matter of a firm which consisted primarily of ladies. And obviously, the firm was formed with a particular intent to avoid tax or reduce or mitigate taxes. At the stage of the assessment, there were significant additions which were even sustained in appeal. And we were visited with a penalty under section 271(1)(c), and that was the matter that was being argued by me. I tried to explain to the tribunal that this is a scenario where, you know, the ladies have actually contributed to the business and things of that sort. And the members were really skeptical. They were, you know, pushing me and saying, you please establish as to what work they have done and so on and so forth. It struck me, as I was trying to recall or recollect my thoughts, I looked at the calendar. If anybody you have visited the tribunal, on the right hand side where the tax council stand, there is a calendar. And I looked at the calendar, which I had not realized earlier. It was 8th March, which was Women's Day. And I remember the name of the member, RP Rajesh, a very stocky man. And what I mentioned to him was, sir, even on this day, which is happens to be a Women's Day, can this bench ever make a statement across the bar that women will not be able to contribute by way of work? And the bench, which was against me for nearly 20-25 minutes, started laughing. It was an appeal. I remember 3,26,000 was the penalty. In 4 minute flats, they closed the hearing. They allowed my appeal. So, thinking on your feet, was something which I have managed to do over a period of time. However, now I will say that the whole concept has changed over a period of time, especially during the last 2 or 3 months, because from September 2020, appeals have become faceless. And I would look at these faceless appeals as an opportunity, because my own assessment is that as chartered accountants, our drafting is far, far better than our system advocates. Advocates tend to be entirely verbose. They write so many pages. You will have seen documents drafted by them. Our profession is a profession where we are able to marshal facts in the best possible manner, more precisely. So I would look at faceless appeals as an opportunity and not something adverse. What I would recommend all of you to do is two things. Number one, if all of you have not read, just look at a small book by the name of, the author's name is Ralph Dobelli, and he has written a book, The Art of Thinking Clearly. You read that book and you will appreciate as to how you can marshal your thoughts in the most limited number of words. Number one. Number two, since written communication is going to be the norm, you will have to learn to become more and more precise. When we appeared before a CIT appeals, then we were able to tell him that, look, sir, a particular situation document is at page 3, read relevant para 4.5. Now you will not be able to communicate that. Therefore, your manner of writing, the cross referencing, very important. So at each point of time, each ground of appeal, the cross reference to the document or case law that you are relying on is going to be extremely important. Even more important, remember that you are going to communicate with a person who is, in any event, the tax officer has got interests which are different from us. His interest is in garnering the maximum revenue, be it revenue for whoever, but that is his maximum interest. Therefore, you are pitted against a person of that mindset. That is something you will have to remember. So you have to ensure that you make your communication precise, you make it interesting, and you give him the least amount of trouble. So cross-referencing. In fact, one of my juniors has thought of an idea and I've started using that. When we say that, all right, please refer to page number so and so, the particular document reference should be embedded in that file, which means that he clicks on that and that document opens. Then you refer to the particular page number, that page number so and so, para number 6. That will help that person to look at only the relevant part of the documentation process. Extremely important, because if you write a treatise of 200 pages, nobody is going to read it. So develop the art of communication, precise communication, cross-referencing. That's going to be the art henceforth. Also, I'll just take a couple of more minutes on the topic of the day. Very interesting topic. Tenancy. Tenancy rights and their tax implications. Remember one thing now is that your appeals are going to be, at least at the first stage, faceless. In fact, if Nirmala Sitharaman had her way, even tribunal would be faceless. I reckon that is not going to happen so soon, but we never know. Having said that, now your appeal will be possibly heard by an officer who is not aware of the factual and legal matrix, and I'm particularly referencing to tenancy. Tenancy laws in Maharashtra are different from tenancy laws across the country. So when you are going to argue a matter, particularly with the reference of a tenancy, please be sure that you refer to the relevant legislation relevant to your case. Because as I said, I remember I was arguing a matter in Hyderabad, and I mentioned casually that this is TDR. Now, TDR is a concept where we in Mumbai are aware what a TDR is. You go down south and they will not find TDR. We are all aware of cooperative movement, cooperative societies. The same situation you will not find in Bangalore. Karnataka is a different thing. So remember this aspect also. So this is how you will go, and I'm very sure that if all of us put our mind to it, we will be definitely successful in arguing our appeals, in presenting our case. Also, one more factor, because we are going to take first and second appeals. Remember that the genesis of these appeals is a shortcoming to some extent at the assessment stage. So remember that the better you present your case at the assessment, many referral clients tell me that, sir, I did not give this because the information was incomplete at that stage. At the assessment stage, put everything that you have, marshal your facts, marshal your documents to the extent possible at the assessment. That will make the life of people like Deepak much more easier for to help you. So help him to help all of you. Once again, I must say that this is an extremely interesting venture propagated by Sagar. I wish him all the well, and yes, as many of your meetings possible, I'll remain present. I will contribute to what extent possible, and I'll close with a small anecdote, because Sagar said that some of us are far more experienced than him. I have probably narrated that at Shivaji Park Study Circle. I remember the first few years of my practice after the birth of my daughter. She said she heard often that her father was a practicing chartered accountant. So one day she came from school, she was in second standard, and she said, Baba, you are still practicing. When are you actually going to start work? And I realized that you are going to be a student for all your life. So with that, I wish Deepak and all of you well. Now I will for a short while close my video. Don't worry, I'm not going to sleep. I will contribute, but over to you, Deepak. Now the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sate sir. Actually, because of this compact meeting, we are doing away with actually the introduction of the speaker or the leader, and I would suggest that Deepak ji, whenever you start speaking, you can give your brief introduction in case you wish to the extent you wish to. So I once again welcome our learned leader of this group, and the format, as I had mentioned, it will be like this: that once he starts explaining, after certain point of time, if he thinks that yes, he has made a point, then he will actually stop and say, okay, now I have completed my point, and if you have got anything to say about this, then we can discuss. Okay, and thereafter, if there is nothing, he will proceed. Otherwise, we'll discuss on that point and we'll proceed further. So this will be the format, and where to stop, that our group leader himself will decide as to what point of time he will give chance to discuss this point among the others. In the meantime, supposing if you feel that something is very, very important, you are free to actually interrupt him and also talk. So that is also not barred over here. Okay, all of us are equal right now. There is nobody who is above, nobody is below. That should be the general way of thinking, and it should be fun. It need not be only knowledge. This meeting can become fun oriented also, but at the same time, our basic aim to get the knowledge out of it. So I would request Deepak sir to start with his leading this group. So you can say whatever you want to say, and then once you say that you want the matter to be discussed, that time I will start sharing the screen. Thank you.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. At the outset, I sincerely thank Sagar for giving me opportunity of presenting this paper on transfer of tenancy and the other allied income tax allied issues. This I will speak in Marathi, one sentence. सागरनी हा जो उपक्रम घेतला आहे, जो सेतू बांधणीचा उपक्रम जो घेतला आहे, त्याच्यामध्ये हा माझा एक फक्त खारीचा वाटा असं मी मानतो त्याच्यामध्ये. Today's topic, before I start with today's topic, since Anil has shared his experience, I would like to share my first experience. I was totally inexperienced. I never assisted anybody senior in my practice. And after almost 5 years of practice, I started practice in 1983. And after 5 years of practice, suddenly one government company approached me. I'll share the name, MAFCO Limited. They asked me to appear before tribunal. I had not appeared even before CIT appeal. And they, first of all, I had to stand in front of tribunal members. It was a department appeal. It was a very simple issue. The government had passed certain GR and transferred certain properties to this government company. And this government company had claimed depreciation on it. The view of the income tax department was that you are not the legal owner. This government company is not the legal owner, and therefore you are not entitled to depreciation. The CIT appeal had held in favor of the company. Somebody else had argued before CIT appeal, and CIT appeal had gone on the basis of legal ownership versus beneficial ownership, and he had allowed the appeal. And the department had gone in appeal to tribunal. And I just appeared in front of the members. I was totally new, raw to the practice, not even had experience of appearing before CIT appeal. And here I'm just simply appearing before ITAT. I just stood in front of the members. The members were very kind. So my first experience was very nice. I didn't have to speak anything. The member said, "Do you know there is an act called Government Grant Act 1885? I said, I just kept quiet. They said, no, we are dismissing government appeal because as per Government Grant Act, the provisions of Transfer of Property Act do not apply to transfer of property by government to its own undertaking. So members are also learned. So we should learn to appear, just stand there and just make arguments. I'll start with today's discussion. Sagar, you can start sharing the screen of the main submissions. Now, this is implication of transfer of tenancy rights and allied issues. I have divided this whole presentation into 11 points. So let me recapture what are all those points. So point number 1 is that immovable property has certain bundle of rights. Number 2, tenancy is not defined under Income Tax Act. So I have taken a definition of tenancy from Maharashtra Rent Control Act. Third point is implication or tax treatment of transfer of tenancy in the hands of the original tenant. This I have divided into 3 parts. 1, there is a sale of tenancy. 2, there is a transfer of tenancy under development agreement where you get ownership flat. Third, when the tenant gets ownership flat and that ownership flat is sold, what would be the tax treatment? So third point is tax treatment in the hands of the tenant. Fourth point is tax treatment in the hands of the legal heirs of the tenant who are not staying with that tenant. So they don't have a tenancy right, but it's more of an occupancy right. Fifth is tax treatment in the hands of a person who has inherited tenancy on the death of the father and he becomes a tenant. Sixth is tax treatment in the hands of landlord. Seventh is tax treatment in the hands of incoming tenant. Eighth is tax treatment on transfer of subtenancy. Then others I have just covered. So ninth is 54F, because when you transfer tenancy, you get exemption under 54F. 10th is depreciation issue on tenancy right as well as leasehold rights. And point number 11 is rent control law. What do you mean by tenancy and how the tenancy is succeeded under rent control law. This, if you want to read, you can read BCA Journal of March 2020. So this is given in detail. I have put it in the nutshell form. So now I come to point number 1. Whenever you acquire any property, then either it is a land or a building. If it is a building, you acquire certain bundle of rights. So when you acquire a property, what are those bundle of rights? Is you have a right of occupancy. Number 2, right to give that property on leave and license basis. Third right is leasehold right. So you can give that property on leasehold basis. Another right is tenancy right. So you can create a tenancy. I had occasion to one of my client purchased a property last year in Shivaji Park, and that document said that it is called a freely transferable tenancy right. So he acquired a tenancy under a document called freely transferable tenancy right. So there is a slight difference between normal tenancy and freely transferable tenancy. In case of a normal tenancy, the landlord enters into picture, and whenever any tenancy is required to be transferred, it is generally a tripartite agreement between the landlord, outgoing tenant, and the incoming tenant. So these are the bundle of rights when you acquire a property which is land and or building. If you even when you acquire a land, it also has a bundle of rights. Like for example, the land will have right of to give that land on mining. The right will have FSI right, the right to load TDR, the right to construct to carry out agricultural activity, so on and so forth. So now we are here concerned with immovable property having bundle of rights, that is land only building. Any other question on this, or anything to be shared? Because I have covered first point.
I have one question, sir.
Yes.
You have mentioned that there is a difference between lease and tenancy. I did not understand that angle. Could you please explain?
Leasehold right is for a specific period. So lease will be for 3 years, 5 years, 99 years. I had occasion to represent Mumbai University. The land which is there in the at Fountain, it is 999 years lease. Whereas tenancy right is, I would say, it's a perpetual right. It's a perpetual lease, you can say.
Yeah. Thank
Also,
you.
Deepak, the one small distinction where what you said is right is that in a tenancy and a lease, a tenancy is a right in personam. Normally, that right is to be enjoyed personally. Lease is a right which is a right in rem, which means you can assign a leasehold right. Tenancy normally is never assignable. I am conscious that there could be an agreement to the contrary, but by and large, tenancy in itself is not assignable, while a lease can be. That's the major distinction.
First class.
Yeah.
Any other?
Yeah. There's just 2 points, Vishnu Kanere here. What you could add or consider there. First is about protected tenants, because the transfer of that might be considered under a different footing in law, although in income tax probably the fallout will be similar, but that is a different kind of tenancy. That is people who became tenants prior to, I think the cutoff date is somewhere in 81 or 84. I can't tell you offhand just now, but I'll tell you after confirmation. All persons, I think it is 1973, yes. All people who became tenants before that, they are known as protected tenants under the Bombay Rent Control Act. So although they may have imperfect documentation, they may not be monthly tenants at that point of time, they were deemed to be tenants under that law, and they cannot be vacated. I mean, even for own use, the landlord cannot repossess or take back the premises. So that tenancy is on a different footing. Although I have not heard of any different view being taken for taxation purpose as far as that kind of tenancy goes. The second one is employees, because I have come across and I have represented a lot of cases like that. Especially very senior employees of companies often stay in company premises. There is no documentation. It is just a premises allotted to that person to live during the time he's working for the company. And these are large multinational companies, I may tell you. and those employees rise to become directors or CFOs or things like that. And at the time when they leave, just because they just don't vacate the premises, often there are court cases or a few notices which come from the company's side, and eventually there is a settlement and the person continues to live on. So for a token amount, the rights of that place are transferred, or that person is inducted as a tenant. So these two are another kinds of occupancies which one finds especially in Mumbai or in Maharashtra, which are not exactly in the nature of tenancy. So I thought you could call it adverse possession, for example.
All
So
these points
these
I
are
have
two
covered.
I want to add. That's all.
All these points I have covered in subsequent points. So occupancy right, I think in case of a director, it would be loosely termed as an occupancy right, and it is not a tenancy right.
Yes, because
And
there is case law that occupancy, I mean,
yes,
amount received as compensation by occupant is exempt. So
yes,
there are one or two case laws to that effect.
yes,
Criminal
I have
judgment.
covered. I have covered those points in my subsequent.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
I have covered that. Yeah. Yeah. But I appreciate everybody is contributing very well. Shall I go to second point or anyone else? So I'll start with the second point. So tenancy is not defined under Income Tax Act. So we should go to section 7 subsection 15 of the Maharashtra Rent Control Act, which defines tenant means any person by whom rent is payable for any premises. So this is a very general definition, that any person by whom rent is payable. And when the tenant dies, the term includes. So the succession to the tenancy is under Maharashtra Rent Control Act. So in case of a residential premises, there are two different rules for succession to tenancy. One in case of residential and in case of non-residential. So in case of a residential premises, any member of his family who is residing with the tenant at the time of his death. And in case of non-residential premises, any member of the family who at the time of the tenant's death is using those premises for the business or for that such purpose, that is business or education purpose. So there is a slight difference here. Then the section says, in the absence of any family member of a tenant, any heir of the tenant, as may be decided by the court in the absence of any agreement with the tenant, will be treated as a tenant. Therefore, under Maharashtra Rent Control Act, tenancy cannot be bequeathed by will. It will pass on as per the Rent Control Act. The Rent Control Act of certain states provide for the, they are silent about this, in which event the tenancy can be given by way of will. But under Maharashtra Rent Control Act, there is a specific provision for succession to the tenancy. Therefore, the normal succession law will not apply, and similarly the will cannot, you cannot make a will in respect of tenancy. So what it says is that in case of a residential premises, any member of his family who is residing with the tenant at the time of his death, it will pass on to that person. So for example, if there is a father and he has two sons, and one son is staying with the father and the other son is staying somewhere else outside, in that event, on death of father, the son who is staying with the father will get that tenancy and not the son who is staying outside. Whereas the father's other property, which will be governed by either normal succession law, Hindu succession law, or it will be governed by will. So succession to the tenancy is dependent upon, first, the whether it is a residential tenancy or it is a non-residential tenancy. In case of a non-residential tenancy, it will be governed. It will go to a person who is occupying those same premises for the same purpose. Sagar, can you go to point number 10 directly, because I have elaborated that further from the BCA journal. So now here, under the rent control law, the family is not defined. So we take a general definition of the family, and which is given in this case by Bombay High Court. Family means all connected by blood relationship or marriage. So for example, if you have a daughter, she is related to you by blood relation, whereas when you get a daughter-in-law and she stays with you, she will be part of the husband's family by marriage. In case of a non-residential premises, on death of a tenant, the person in occupation of and carrying on business and not with the other heirs. So the tenancy will go by the person who is occupying those business premises along with that tenant. It will not go to the heirs of the person of the deceased tenant. Members of the family residing with the deceased tenant get protection and not the other members of the family. This is again Supreme Court decision in Vasant Pratap Pandit. This is a landmark decision. Now, the very interesting case came before Bombay High Court. There were two tenants, that is one brother, and the two brothers were staying in that property. So the brother made, after the death of one brother, the other brother said that our HUF is the tenant and therefore all members should be made as tenants. So the Bombay High Court said, no, the tenancy is individual specific. So the next brother only will get and not all the family members of the HUF. The other part of the section says that in the absence of family members, heirs as decided by the court will become the tenant. So brother of the male tenant would be heir. But the brother-in-law, that means the brother of the female tenant not being heir of his husband, will not succeed. So if husband is a tenant and then he expires, then his wife's brother cannot become a tenant because he is not a relative. Since the tenancies are governed by the governing regulation, transfer only to the family members of the deceased tenant, and if the governing law is silent, then succession will be applicable. Therefore, I explained in first point at the beginning itself that Maharashtra Rent Control Act is very specific. Therefore, the succession to the tenancy will be governed by that law and not by will or by succession law. Maybe in other states, if the tenancy law is silent, the tenancy succession will be governed by that law. Sagar, can you go to point number 3, please?
So you want to stop and discuss at this point, or you want to take up?
Yes. Okay, we can stop and discuss at this point.
Okay. So if anybody has got any questions, points.
Anybody want to go in for details of this, the factual position, you can refer BCA Journal, March 2020.
Deepak, what I wanted to ask was, am I audible?
Yes.
The question is, supposing the tenanted premises, एखादी बिल्डिंग मध्ये माझी टेनंटेड प्रिमाइसेस आहेत आणि अशी बिल्डिंग पडली तर काय होतं त्या टेनंटेड प्रिमाइसेस?
I think those who are lawyers, those can explain. But since I am also myself tenant in one building, I had asked some lawyer, and what he told me is that your tenancy right goes. It doesn't continue.
That is what I was also told. आणि
But those who are lawyers, they can guide us better.
आणि हीच गोष्ट पानिपत मध्ये झाली असं म्हटलं गेलं म्हणून. ठीक आहे, थँक्यू.
No, actually, see, the right of redevelopment or reconstruction depends on who is the owner of the land. So tenancy is not in respect of premises. It is only in respect of the structure. So unless there is an agreement between the landlord and the association of tenants, because nowadays there are new thing coming up, namely association of tenants, which is something loosely equivalent to a cooperative society. I won't call it that, or an apartment scheme. But this association of tenants can have some agreements with the landlord, because the landlord is unable to maintain or upkeep the premises, and these are very old buildings. So if there is such an agreement and the tenants have contributed monies for redevelopment, in that case, normally a right is created in favor of the tenants association of the underlying land by charging some lease premium. If that has been done, then the tenants association and so in turn the tenants will have a right to reconstruct the property when it falls. But otherwise, normal position is whoever owns the underlying land has not given the land on lease. So technically, if the building falls, the rights along with it get, I mean,
Extinguished.
the rights are over, they are extinguished. Correct.
Rights have to lapse.
Yeah. Yeah.
So supposing in the old scenario, sometimes we see that in one house there used to be some 7, 8, 9 people staying together, and rent receipt is only in the name of one person. So when that person dies, all the remaining persons will get, or only senior of them, or how it will go?
Only one. See, generally tenancy right is specific to one. So rent receipt is issued in the name of one person. And if you read the definition, it says that tenant means any person by whom the rent is payable for any premises. So after demise of that person, only one person will become tenant, not all 7. So other 6 will have a occupancy right.
But how do you decide which person will become? Supposing if you have 2 brothers, then elder brother or something?
No. So they will have to go to approach landlord and say that we want to transfer the rent receipt in the name of any one person. So they have to come to a conclusion.
Correct. Actually, what happens is the landlord or his manager will ask all of them, all the legal heirs, to sign and appoint one person. You have to get the signatures of all legal heirs. Otherwise, that transfer remains pending with the landlord. They don't do it.
So, relating to this, was it a mere change of name of the tenant involves transfer of tenancy right here? That is, say, after the death of the tenant there, if somebody requests from his family, or family, that transfer this to the guy there, so mere transfer of name or change of name
In the rent receipt.
Actually, Satya sir has explained this already, but if you want, I can just offer my 2 cents for this. Actually, when there is a change of, I mean, it is not just a change of name. What happens is, under the Maharashtra, that is that Bombay Rent Control Act, tenancy is a monthly tenancy. So it is a relationship between the tenant, in whose name the rent receipt exists, and the landlord. It is a personal, individual relationship. The moment the person ceases to be alive or becomes unavailable because of any other reason, because he surrenders it or whatever, the new person who comes in his place, although who will come in his place and various things may be decided by the law, but still it is a new or a fresh tenancy which is created with that new person. Although a landlord may be forced to transfer because of operation of law, but still it is not the same tenancy. It changes its character. That person becomes a new tenant, and that's the position actually.
For the purpose of income tax, it is there is a separate decision. We will come to that in this situation later.
Okay.
It is called inheritance of tenancy. Technically, there is no inheritance, but we will come to that in my point number 5. We'll come to that later.
In fact, I have a short point, Deepak, on this before you go further. From what Kanhere Sahib said, an interesting proposition occurred to me. Now, we just said that there was person X, there were Y, Z staying with him. X expired and Y became a tenant. Now, after Y became a tenant, if the tenancy subsisted for less than 3 years, would the tenancy in that person's hands be short term so as to exclude a claim for 54F, or will you be able to urge the merger theory and say that X and Y were staying together, X was a tenant, Y in any event on account of his staying had an occupancy, we got finally merged or crystallized into a tenancy right? I'm just thinking of an hypothetical proposition. We appreciate that the cost of acquisition will always by and large be nil, but the question of
Anil, that's very interesting phenomena. If the original tenant sells, there is a different working, and if
Exactly.
the
If the
inherit
new
right,
tenant says,
yes. So this revolves around interpretation of section 55, and it's very interesting. And when I read that, I told Sagar that I want to present this topic because it's very interesting.
Yes,
It's
Deepak
very
sir,
interesting.
just two more points for your table. That is, whenever you deal with it.
Hmm.
First one is what happens to claim for just now we thought of a situation that there are say three or four brothers or relatives,
Hmm.
and they have to elect from amongst who are staying together, not necessarily brothers. They could be some other relations also. Now they have to elect from amongst themselves or other decide who in whose name the rent receipt is going to come. So two possibilities are there because both of them have happened in my case, and in most cases the cases have gone through. In one case I had difficulty, but eventually it got sorted out in the sense that no addition was made on the account eventually. See
No,
what happened is
he was transferred.
one possibility. I'll just explain to you what it is, and then you tell your experience about it when the time comes. One is where a person has given some amount of money to the rest of them, and that person's name has been put as the tenant in the premises.
Correct.
So that is first scenario. The second scenario is that when such premises are transferred, because now you are allowed to officially take money in surrender of a tenancy. The tenant, earlier it was prohibited by law, it was an offense to
Correct.
offer or give or take pagdi. But now pagdi, as it is known as, or salami, is regularized under Bombay Rent Control Act. So when premises are sold, compensation is paid to these other people who were co-occupants when the original tenant passed away and who had permitted the other person's name to be added. So what is the tax treatment? A, in their hands. B, whether it is allowed as a deduction. I have claimed it as a deduction and I have taken it as capital gains in the hands of the others, although you have suggested otherwise. But it has been accepted in due scrutiny also without an issue. But I would like your views on this. That is, what has happened is there is a
So
premises in
broadly,
which
yes, broadly,
broadly I've understood it. Okay,
yeah,
fine. So
broadly,
these are the two things I want to put on table, that when a person pays compensation, when his name is being put forward as a tenant, that would probably come in as a part of his cost of acquisition. That is my proposition. And the second one is compensation paid when that person in turn sells or transfers the tenancy or surrenders the tenancy. That would be allowed as a deduction in computing the capital gain in that person's hands. Right. Yeah. Okay.
these points, yeah, some of these points are covered in serial number 4 and 5. There were interesting decisions, and when I was reading them, I found them very interesting. So those will come in the subsequent points. Any other point on point number 2 and point number 11? Oh. Shall we go to point number 3 then?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Sagar, point number 3.
Somebody asking a question whether tenants' right can be jointly owned. Of course,
Generally,
this is not a
landlord
legal forum.
don't
but
issue
if you know
receipt
the
in
answer, you can.
it is single name.
But I have the specific knowledge where the receipt is made in the name of a husband and wife together, and it is prior to 1998. And well, I don't know whether such receipt is valid or not, but that's what the fact is, and it's in Mumbai.
I think that is an exception because one of my clients is a partnership firm and the tenancy is in the name of the firm. That again, I think is not okay, but well, it is there. We can't help it.
So then it will go by that old thing, whether it is a joint tenancy versus tenants in common. That issue.
Because the partners could be tenants in common, maybe, or we don't know. So there are multiple tenants actually, but I don't think that's actually the norm.
Correct. Now we come to tax treatment in the hands of the original tenant when he transfers the tenancy and he actually sells. First is when there is a complete sale of tenancy. So sale consideration will be treated as a full value of consideration, and 50C is not applicable to transfer of tenancy. Section 50C uses word land or building. So there are various decisions which have held that 50C does not apply to anything other than land and building, like tenancy, leasehold rights. Some of the decisions are very interesting, that if you have a booking right in a flat and before you get possession of the flat and you transfer the booking right itself, that is not land and building. Therefore 50C does not apply. Sagar, can you open Annexure 3A1?
Yes, I'll do that.
There are many decisions, but I've selected only one, and go below, there is a conclusion after that. No. No. Up. 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 Yeah, this is the conclusion. Section 50C was only for limited purpose of computing capital gain in respect of sale of land and building, when such sale takes place, and stamp duty value had to be substituted for sale consideration if the sale consideration was less than stamp duty value. Hence, in case of a surrender of tenancy right, provisions of section 50C would not apply. There are many other decisions also, but I have just selected only one. What will be the cost of acquisition in such case? This is a consideration. What is the cost of acquisition? You have to go to section 55 2A Roman 1. It says cost will be cost whatever you have actually paid. So if you have paid for that tenancy, it will be treated as that cost of acquisition. Now section 55 2A subclause 2 says, otherwise cost will be taken to be nil except when the tenancy is acquired under 49(1)(1) to 49(1)(4). So we'll come to that. This is a very interesting proposition, that cost will be taken as nil only in case of the original tenant. As per this section, if you have acquired a tenancy on succession, on the death of the original tenant, and if any of the courts have, the tribunals have held that 49 section 1 applies because it is inherited tenancy, in which event you cannot take cost as nil. So whenever anybody approaches you, you'll have to understand whether he's an original tenant or whether he has acquired it under succession. Or if, I don't know, tenancy cannot be gifted, to my limited knowledge. So if somebody gifts a tenancy, creates a gift deed kind of thing and gifts a tenancy, again, in the hands of the donee, the tax treatment will be different. You cannot take cost as nil. So this section of nil cost applies only to original tenant.
But Deepak, in that case, what will be the cost? It will be the cost to the original owner.
I will come to that. I will come to that. It is very interesting, Anil. 55(2). I read it interestingly this time, and it is very interesting. That's why we will come to all of these points in subsequent. There is a direct Supreme Court decision which says that if income falls under a particular head, capital gain, then it cannot fall under a residuary head, even if it is not taxable under that head. So that's a very clear position of law now. If for any reason that it falls under the head capital gain, if it is not taxable under that head, 56 is not in that sense a residuary head that merely because it is not taxable as capital gain, it will be taxed as income from other sources. This is a DP Sandhu Brothers case. You can open 3A4. See, in between, one court had held that this is a casual non-recurring receipts, and therefore the section 56 will apply, and therefore if you get money for transfer of tenancy till before 1995, it was not taxable, because on the basis of the reasoning that if the computation section fails, charging section fails. These were the judgments regarding goodwill, tenancy right, and various other intangible assets. So applying that same reasoning, the Supreme Court said that it is not taxable because the computation section fails, charging section fails. So department sought to take another alternative, that it will be taxed under income from other sources, 56, because it doesn't fall under that. The Supreme Court said no. If it falls under the head capital gain, it will be taxable only under the head capital gain, and if it is not taxable under that head, it cannot be taxed under residuary head.
Sathe sir, you can probably share your experience about Cadell Mills.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Because that would be relevant in this context, what Deepak sir mentioned.
No, there is one more aspect to it, is that the question of maybe 2 or 3 aspects one needs to remember. Number one is that the amendment to 55 came in 1995. Now the question therefore would be that what would happen if an inheritance arose prior to that date? What would happen when the acquisition was pre-95, post-95? Also the theory of merger. So Cadell is one part of it, but quite a few things will turn. And Deepak, the point only was like this, is that we are saying that because in all these cases, they relied on the principle that the machinery provision fails. But the machinery provision fails if the cost is indeterminable.
Correct.
The question is, where if Balmukunda Acharya, which I think you have referred to somewhere, the question is whether the cost is nil, or when the 55 says the cost is deemed to be nil, but there could be a case that there is actually no cost. When there is actually no cost, then whether you can still use the principle of Srinivasa Sethi is also a matter of conjecture. So therefore, according to me, this is important. So anyway, I think you have a lot to travel, so I will not get into it. But yes, Cadell has 2 or 3 aspects. One, whether this is 95, pre-95, post-95 situation. The second issue would be whether merger of rights theory pre-95, post-95 still survives, and many other angles. But I think Deepak, you take it further, because otherwise you're already at 11.
Yeah. But this is a very interesting point which I made. But in spite of all these amendments, there is a decision of a Bombay High Court in which said that if your FSI increases from say 1 to 2 or 1 to 1.5, that 0.5% increase in FSI, since it does not involve cost, if you sell that, there is no capital gain.
Let's see how jurisprudence develops on this.
In fact, even if a part of the cost of acquisition is indeterminate, or even if the cost of addition is indeterminate, then the charge fails. That is the idea behind it.
That is the idea. Anyone else on this?
Sir, one question again, simple thing. If the father doesn't, if the cost is not determinable, that is the father has acquired it from his father, and now after the father's death or during the life of the father only, if the father, as you said earlier, that the tenancy cannot be gifted, but if the father himself has not acquired it by paying some cost to it, and then if he just transfers it to the son, whether it involves the transfer of tenancy right, means where is the consideration involved in that? It's just a nominal name change, which they can just ask the manager to change the name in the son's name. So, what is the cost consideration, sir, or for that matter?
Yes, all these questions are being answered in point number 4 and 5.
Okay.
We will address those issues in point number 4 and 5.
Yeah.
Now we come to clause B, 3B. Actually, these are the interesting points which I thought, that's why I told Sagar that I would like to share these points with you. These are very interesting points. So now we are talking about transfer of tenancy under redevelopment agreement. The date of transfer would be the date on which tenant gets permanent alternate accommodation on ownership basis if development agreement provides that tenancy will continue till permanent alternate accommodation is given. Sagar, can you open this 3B1? So this is a very interesting decision, but it is contradicting itself in the decision itself. So it will require a lot of clarity.
You know which part of this decision you want me to take?
Go to the top first. Go to the top first. Yeah. Up.
Yeah, no, this is the beginning, no, sir?
Yeah. Go up.
Show that bold part.
Bold part. Bold part.
Okay.
See, I'll read this. Here, I find there is some contradiction in what they are saying. Capital gains chargeability, tenancy rights vis-a-vis sale of right to possess floor space. Assessee gave up his tenancy in a building in lieu of right to possess 15,000 square feet of floor space in new building. Tenancy stood terminated when assessee gave up the position. Here he says it's like this. Then right of tenancy was transferred for a consideration of right to possess the said floor space, which is not taxable as capital gain as assessee had incurred no cost. Capital gain arose when the said floor space was transferred to different parties for monetary consideration. Right to possess floor space or possession thereof is a capital asset under section 214. No doubt about it. Monthly payment made by the assessee to the landlord after termination of tenancy cannot be treated as rent, but it is paid to nurture, to protect, to maintain the right to possess floor space, and therefore it is in the nature of cost of improvement of the asset. AO has rightly taken the cost of acquisition of right to possess as nil, as assessee has not exercised any option. Therefore, CITA was not justified in excluding the capital gain from the total income. Now you come to para 11 of that. Now let's read para 11. Here they have gone on the concept of extinguishment of right in the assets versus extinguishment of asset itself. So what further emerges and follows is that transfer includes extinguishment of right. Extinguishment of right in the asset has been distinguished from extinguishment of asset itself by Supreme Court in case of Vania Silk Mills, wherein it has been held, reversing the decision of the High Court, that the capital gain tax was attracted under section 45 by transfer and not merely by extinguishment of right, howsoever brought about. Whatever the mode by which the transfer was brought about, the existence of the asset during the process of transfer was a precondition. Unless the asset existed in fact, there could not be any transfer of it. So here, thus in this decision, it has been held that if the asset itself gets extinguished, there is no question of transfer, and consequently no capital gain or loss results from the disappearance of the asset itself. In the instant case, the right of the tenancy in itself extinguished on 20th September 1993, and therefore there is no question of transfer of it in June 1985, and consequently consequently, no capital gain arises from disappearance of tenancy right. What he says is here that you give the tenancy to the builder, he enters into possession, he pulls down the building. Here it says it's the extinguishment of asset itself, and he is applying Vania Silk Mills, and he says therefore the capital gain, if any, is taxable in the year of 1995, 1993, not in 1985. This is a very complicated judgment, so we need to understand whether really this can be argued. I mean, this will hold good. So, in nutshell, they are here trying to say that in the year in which you get the possession of your permanent alternate accommodation, that year the capital gain will be taxed, not in the year when you enter into development in the permanent alternate accommodation agreement and handover. Now 45(5)(a), which has been introduced, it again talks about land and building only. See, if you read 45(5)(a), I will read it for everybody. 45(5)(a) says, notwithstanding anything contained in subsection 1, where the capital gain arises to an assessee being an individual or HUF from the transfer of capital asset being land or building or both under a specified agreement, the capital gain would be chargeable. So here it says that if you are owner of the property and you go in for a development agreement and you get something in kind, that is in terms of, so 45(5)(a) does not apply here to transfer of tenancy, because we are taking a stand that for the purpose of 50C does not apply because it is not land and building. Same reasoning will apply for 45(5)(a) also. Therefore, 45(5)(a) will not come to the rescue of the assessee when you transfer tenancy under development agreement. But whether this decision can help us to postpone the taxation of tenancy right on in case of a redevelopment to the year in which you get the possession of your flat.
Sir, but I think the tax is arising because he has sold it in turn to other parties. If he had retained it, then probably, according to the view of the judgment, there was no tax liability.
No. Generally, most of these agreements specify that the tenancy will continue till you get your permanent alternate accommodation. Generally, most of the agreements contain that clause to protect the rights of the tenant. Some of the advocates even say that you continue to pay monthly rent to the landlord. You may be getting rent from the builder for your alternate accommodation, temporary alternate accommodation, but you should continue to pay rent to your own landlord.
But this judgment, the Lordship has said that those payments are not actually rent, but they are paid for
cost
maintaining that right. So he is going by his own theory. My point is this: he has held it as taxable because that 15,000 square feet has been in turn transferred to third parties for consideration of 45,50,000. That is what is tried to be taxed. Not if it was retained.
In fact, Deepak, this is a totally confused decision because this starts off with the proposition that the tenancy got extinguished.
Correct.
Now, if the tenancy extinguished, how do you correlate that extinction of the tenancy with a possessory right for 15,000 square feet?
Yeah.
That itself linkage, and thereafter they say that the capital gain arose because that possessory right was transferred. So, according to me, there are two distinct situations, two distinct assets. One was the first tenancy right which got extinguished. Now, how they related that tenancy right with the possessory right of 15,000 square feet is not clear from this judgment. Correct. So, frankly, I would say that one should not rely on this sort of judgment.
So you should tax it in the year you hand over the possession of the flat.
Because according to me, at that point of time, what effectively happens is, in normal development agreements where there is a permanent alternate accommodation which is offered, the real question that would arise is that you give possession of your tenanted premises to the developer. Now the building is pulled down. If at that point of time you have a vested right in the permanent alternate accommodation which is capable of alienation, to my mind that at that point of time the transfer is complete, because if your permanent alternate accommodation with for which you have surrendered your tenancy or you have surrendered your possession is alienable, then in that case your vesting is complete. To my mind, the capital gain arises at that point of time, unless the agreement of permanent alternate accommodation specifies that your tenancy is in suspension. I think there is a specific provision to that effect. So therefore, if your tenancy is in suspension till you receive possession, if that happens, then of course you will continue to remain a suspended tenant and your tenancy will permanently get extinguished only on the possession of the permanent alternate accommodation. You have said that in your note. So
Yeah.
I think that is the, it will really depend on what two things. One, whether the tenancy is suspended or not, and more importantly, whether the right to permanent alternate accommodation is alienable. If it is alienable, then I think you have an issue of the vesting being complete.
Sir, but then do you suggest that when there is such an alienable right, assessee should file a computation claiming 54F and
That's right. That's
showing
right.
the alienable right as a value?
That's,
Because see,
that's
we have done that and got the cost of acquisition on record. In fact,
that,
that seems to be quite a popular view with a lot
yes.
of
Yes.
practitioners, that bring that asset value on record by showing a reinvestment under 54F where it is possible. Hmm.
Yes. Yes.
But one other school of thought exists that don't show any taxable gain because it is not taxable. So
Since
The problem there is, what happens is sometimes the builders don't perform only, and the whole project keeps on hanging. Subsequently, if you get higher price, there cannot be transfer twice. So
Deepak, it's like this. We are on a session of appeals.
Yeah.
So in appeals, what is the determining factor? Who is your client and what do you want?
No, and another point which I would like to point out, that as Anilji has rightly said, I like that term, so temporary and permanent suspension of tenancy, because many agreements do not take this into consideration, and then according to me, really, unless we take that 54F view, and which is in the facts, many times, according to me, in appeal also, the period of holding also will become very difficult to mention. If that new accommodation is sold relatively soon, more less than 2 years now, earlier 3 years, then in that case, possessory rights, tenancy rights, and actual rights, ownership rights, this distinction has to be made for deciding the period of holding of the new asset, according to me.
No. See,
Sometimes,
you claim, there are a lot of issues involved in this. So say, as we have said, that suppose you are saying that transfer took place in the year in which you handed over possession under permanent alternate accommodation, still I advise clients that you have to retain that house, that permanent alternate accommodation, after you receive it for more than 3 years. The 2 years limit is for short term and long term, but under 54F as well as under section 54, you cannot
Yes.
transfer that for 3 years. So you should not transfer that in between. And withdrawal of 54F is more stringent than withdrawal of 54.
yes.
Yes.
No, that means you treat that as new asset or new house from the date you get possession.
Yes.
So in between, the right word was it's suspended. Anyway, it's very depends on facts, and now it becomes difficult. Not this is not the right.
Madam, I would suggest that before you speak, if you could just take your name, then others would also recognize you.
Uma Mahadevkar.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Shall we go to point number B2? 3B2.
Yeah.
Three B2 says that, see, if it is a residential tenancy and in lieu of that, you are allotted a residential premises.
Sagar, it is in typewritten
Okay,
note.
okay.
It is not in case law.
So in 3B2, if in lieu of tenancy, you are allotted a residential house, then you can claim 54F, provided you have held that tenancy for more than 3 years, subject to, of course, compliance with provisions of section 54F. I would recommend only two major points. There are many points, but two major points, because there is a lot of difference between section 54 and 54F. Under 54, it is house to house, and under 54F, it is anything other than house into house. In case of 54, you have to invest capital gain. In case of 54F, you have to invest net sale consideration. But 54F requires two conditions. One, that is on the date of transfer of your tenancy right or any other asset other than the residential house, you should not own more than one house. And the second condition, which is very, very relevant, is you should not purchase another house or a different house within 2 years or construct within 3 years. So, but 54F, there is one Madras High Court judgment which has said that if you are joint holder of another property along with your, say, spouse, that should not be counted. I feel don't depend on this judgment, but it is better that you own only one house. So suppose you own one house and you sell tenancy and buy another house, fair enough. But if you own 10 houses, you sell your 10th house and buy 11th house, it is fine. There is no problem. But in case of tenancy, you should not own more than one residential house. However, if the tenancy, in lieu of tenancy, you are getting a shop or a commercial place, straight off there is a tax. You will not get any deduction or exemption under 54F. You will not get even 54EC also, because 54EC now has been applicable. You can invest only in respect of land and buildings.
Yeah, can I just add something here, sir?
Yes.
Just two things. One is, I remembered because I was hearing the budget speech by Pranab Mukherjee. Pranab Mukherjee is the one who has brought this provision of second house being permitted. That is, assessee can have one other house when he is claiming 54F. So what he said in the budget speech was that especially in urban areas, many people have tenanted premises already. They have one tenanted house. That is why I'm bringing this provision, which is a bit surprising because a tenanted house is not actually owned. So,
correct.
That's a very odd comment, I thought, at that point of time. The second point which I want to make is, sir, that if a person, especially, we have found that the name of a spouse is added for the sake of convenience. So now what we advise the clients is to add that line saying that the other name is added for convenience, because otherwise what happens is department tries to say that it is jointly owned, and therefore they say you already have another house, two other houses. So we have to clarify that those second names added are only for convenience, and no ownership right per se in terms of investment in that house does not it does not exist. That was just the thing to be mentioned. So according to him, tenanted house is also a ownership house, or that is what he thought in bringing around this provision.
Deepak sir, one more thing, that the topic is becoming very, very interesting, but we have to also keep in mind our timeline. So because some members had suggested that 11:30 should be generally the maximum time.
Yes.
So we can continue up to 11:30 and thereafter probably we'll have to go to the next session. This is my suggestion. Okay.
Fine. So there are 8 minutes still. So shall we take point number C then? 3C.
You don't have to rush through the points. You can take up the point as you want.
Yeah. 3C is very interesting point. You had a tenancy. In lieu of that tenancy, you got ownership right, and subsequently you sold ownership right. So what should be the cost of acquisition of the ownership flat which you got? So here this decision says that cost of acquisition of the ownership flat is to be taken to be the market value on the date of acquisition of flat. So for example, if you have entered into a say development agreement in say 2001, you got the possession of that property in say 2004, and in 2020 you are selling it. Then what should be the cost of acquisition? So this is a very interesting decision, 3C1. Can you go to 3C1? This decision says that on the date on which you got that property, you should take the market value. Now, very interestingly, this is a very interesting decision. What it says is, this assessee contended that he has taken certain price. That is, he went to the builder and said, in the year in which I got possession, you sold for flat for what price? So that price, that rate he has adopted as his cost of acquisition. So here they are applying section 55 subsection 2. And in this decision, they are saying when you sell these ownership premises, which you got in lieu of your tenancy, right? In the year in which you got the possession of that property, you take the market value of that property and you deduct that.
Yes, sir. Here I have one thing to add. If you look at, if you have the Income Tax Act, there is a section just before 50C, I think, or just after 50C, which has been introduced a few years back. So we have successfully taken that in order to take this view. Even apart from this judgment, actually what it says is that where an asset is transferred and the market value or the fair market value is, or the consideration is not determinable,
it is 50D.
It's 50D. Then it will be taken as the fair market value or market price of the asset being acquired in its place. So the fair market value of the flat becomes the value of the tenancy, and then you can, therefore that becomes the cost of acquisition. Now, in this context, I want to park with you also one more thing. If this is the proposition, then what happens if the tenancy was acquired prior to now, of course, 1/4/2001. So can one substitute the market value as on 1/4/2001 as the deemed cost of acquisition of tenancy?
No. Here I have not sold.
No, I'm not talking about this particular point 3C which you are discussing. I'm saying this is a proposition which I want you to add it to your discussion when we continue it. That what happens where a tenancy is acquired prior to the date of FMV? Can the owner substitute, and can the inheritor of tenancy substitute the fair market value as on 1/4/2001 if that acquisition in his hands has taken place prior to that date?
For you now, last year, that is in last year's 2020 budget, they in the Finance Act they have said that when you substitute 2001 value, that value cannot exceed stamp duty ready reckoner value. So that also we should keep it in mind.
Yes. So now generally what happens is, how we do it for that is, at least in Mumbai, there's something like a 60-40 ratio. So 60% comes to the tenant and 40% goes to the, that keeps varying. But this is all practical issues. So therefore we go by rule of thumb and say that 60% of the market value as per the of the property as per the stamp duty rate would become the fair market value. I mean, one could adopt, I mean, the actual valuation is a different story. How it is done, probably it's the job of the registered valuer. The point which I am making is, if the acquisition is prior to that cutoff date of 1/4/2001 now, whether substitution of FMV is possible.
I will just interrupt 1 minute. In a clause in the stamp duty of Maharashtra, there is a clause on valuation of stamp duty for tenancy agreements. I'm sure you all must be aware that stamp duty doesn't have any tenancy part for valuation. But there is one clause there that tenancy agreement should be valued at 30 to 40% only of the market rate. But the stamp office registrar does not agree but there is a clause which I have quoted in one of my cases, and successfully we have succeeded.
See, but even in this case, whenever that there is an agreement, that tenancy agreement or permanent alternate accommodation agreement also shows market value as well as consideration. The consideration they show it as nil, but there is a what we call bazar mulya in Marathi. So it shows. So there is method of valuing that. But as we have said, that 50C does not apply to tenancy.
Correct. What you are mentioning
Absolutely
here is
agree.
another aspect. See, there are two aspects here. One is if a tenancy gets transferred, I mean, rather if one gets a permanent alternative accommodation in lieu of tenancy, then the value of that, the cost of acquisition of that would be the fair market value of the permanent alternative accommodation itself, that is the flat itself, which is one
Correct.
proposition which you have put forth, which is
Correct.
not in dispute. 50D just supports it now.
Correct.
The other proposition which I am trying to put forth is that where the tenancy has not actually been transferred, but the date of 1/4/2001 is past, that is, it is encountered on the way. Post 1/4/2001, can it be claimed that the cost of acquisition would be the fair market value of that tenancy, whatever manner it could be determined in, as
No,
on
the
1/4/2000?
problem there is 55(2)(a)(1) clearly says that if you have not paid any cost will be taken as nil. Therefore, you cannot substitute fair market value there.
No, but when I'm
If you have
inherited
paid
it,
for
I
it,
may
if
not
I-
be the original one.
Hmm.
If I am the one who have inherited it, then I could probably substitute the 1/4/2001 value.
Yes,
That's the
because
proposition I'm
it-
making.
yes. So that is the point number 5 we are covering. Point number 5 we are covering in that. Yes.
Okay.
But the High Court has said that you will not get benefit of indexation. Very interestingly, we should read that judgment very carefully.
Okay, but there is a Chandigarh tribunal judgment which says that indexation should be given.
No, but this is the Bombay High Court, so we are more
Bombay
worried
High Court
about.
takes precedence. Yes, of course.
Yeah. I'm more worried about that. Yeah. Sagar, do you want to continue or you want to stop?
Hello.
Sagar, do you want to continue or you want
Hello,
to stop?
Deepak sir. Hello, Deepak sir.
Yes.
Sir, there's one query. What you have mentioned that in last budget there was some substitution that the fair market value, if anybody wants to substitute fair market value as on 2001, it should not exceed the stamp duty valuation. The
Correct.
stamp duty valuation as on 1/4/2001 or the date.
Yes,
As on 1/4/2001.
1/4/2000.
1/4/2001.
Okay.
Say for example, in Dadar area, stamp duty rate in 2001 was say 10,000 per square feet. And but if you can show that comparative instance is say 12,000, earlier we could substitute 12,000. Now you can't do that. You'll have to go by 10,000.
And suppose okay, fair market is suppose 9,000, stamp duty is 10,000, then I have to substitute 9,000, isn't it?
No. You can.
Now it is directly fair market stamp duty rate.
Then you can directly substitute stamp duty value. You don't have to go to fair market value then.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir.
Actually, I think amendment was brought about because in most cases capital gains started becoming zero. Because it was a reverse working kind of situation in practice.
Correct. Like in when the value for 81 was substituted, the department faced problem because 1978 I think was a Antule time, and because of that cement scandal, the prices had gone up. So therefore, when 81 value was substituted, the capital gain came down.
Yes, often there was capital loss.
Yeah.
81 value and indexation. Correct.
So what I would suggest you is that on these particular points which you have discussed, if anybody has to ask any questions, that person can ask, but no new point will be taken now. So if there is anything based on whatever you discussed,
So the other points 4 to 10 we will discuss in next session.
yeah, of course.
Can we come to the fourth point? Or
I think now participants are tired. mentally you decide.
And it's very late, sir. It's very late.
Ah.
No, we'll take it next time. No
Yeah,
problem.
yeah. This is something, the willingness versus the reality. Okay, we are willing to
And
continue.
the home people, sir.
So okay, so actually, let me tell you that, sir, we are not. I am not the only one. We have got a team of coordinators, and one of the persons in coordination is Mr. Dipesh, who is also active member. So if Dipesh is there, Dipesh, are you there? Yeah, Dipesh, I would request you to just sum up in 2 or 3 minutes. How did you feel, and how I mean, it's not something like a Thanksgiving, but just to sum up the things. And before he does that, I would like to thank all the participants in general who have been patiently hearing. So Dipesh, you can just take over.
Just Sagar sir, just one small thing.
Mhm.
Since all of you are here, so I just thought whether we can, in 2 minutes, I would like to share what would be the topic next time, because
Mhm.
Sagar had asked me to
Yeah.
look at it. So I thought if we could look at McDowell's judgment, kind of, and its implications, especially because now we have this concept of, although it's getting deferred in the tax audit every year, I think now from next year it won't get deferred. So whether a transaction is born out of commercial expediency or whether it is entirely aimed at tax avoidance. So this tax avoidance, tax evasion, and tax planning probably, and decisions centering those, they are very significant. And I thought whether we could take that as the next topic. That's just one suggestion. Now, since we next time would also be discontinued, we still have more days to think about what could be taken next time. Right.
Yes, Azadi Bachao Andolan reduced the rigors of
Yes.
McDowell. Otherwise, we faced a lot of problems with McDowell.
Sagar, what I wanted to ask you was, am I audible?
Yeah, sir.
That any specific reason for choosing Thursday? So that, if at all something spills over and we are really sitting on Friday, then in that case, people can have a little more time.
No, actually, Saturday is also a day when we have that GST thing. That's why probably.
Okay.
हमारी सकाळी GST चा.
Okay. No quarrel.
But yeah, suggestions are always welcome. This is our first meeting, and I mean, with looking at the participation, I think it's really going to be useful. So I would suggest.
Sagar, do you think we should have a gap of 14 days between this first 3 points and the other points, or you want to have a lesser gap?
We can actually discuss that personally. I mean, if we'll take the view of the participants and those who are attending in the group itself, will ask this question rather than deciding it right away.
I appreciate. Yeah, because if we have it say roughly tomorrow, then you are fresh with what happened yesterday, and then we continue. But if you do it after 14 days, maybe the link for the first 4 points is gone.
Sagar sir, even I agree with Deepak sir's view that we should, since the first three points are very much technical, so it will be better if we complete it at one go. Otherwise, Deepak sir would have to incur additional time and effort to again explain the another first 3 points and then take over the balance part.
Okay, we'll think about it, Dipesh. So you can just sum up the things for the time being.
Yeah. So first of all, sir, a very good session. It was very enriching. Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks a lot, Sagar sir, for organizing such a seminar. Thank you, Deepak sir. Thank you, Vishnu sir and Anil sir, for contributing their thoughts and experiences over their all the experiences they have gone through their life and the litigation experience. It was very enriching and it was a very good learning experience for me. the discussions were quite a lot practical and fruitful, and we are looking forward to having many more discussions, sir.
Can we close the meeting?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, sir, once again from the bottom of my heart that you have
Yeah, bye.
accepted our request. Sate sir, Deepak sir, and Vishnu sir is always helpful in all these matters. So I hope that, and even Kolhapur, and then people from Pune are there, people from Surat are there, people from Delhi are there. So actually, it is really interesting to see how many more people join next time. Thanks a lot. Let's have a good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks. Good night. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.